Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Global History. I'm your host, Langella Sensei. How you guys doing today? Last time we were here, we were talking about really how important the impact of the Crusades really had on the rest of medieval society. Remember, we talked about how obviously there's a lot of stuff going on. There's church reforms going on, there's the Crusades going on, and at home there's an entire shift in the way in which medieval society was being developed. So just imagine that. Because of the churches having these different reforms, and because the Crusades, all those knights are going to battle to take back the Holy Lands, the people that were at home had changed the entire outlook of what they were doing previously. Remember, with the development of guilds, we started to see an increase in population growth because of the new farming practices with the three-field system. We even saw a massive commercial revolution where now more people had access to better goods. Wealth was now increasing in a lot of these different areas, and now even merchants had a lot of influence over general society. We saw an increase in businesses and banking, and in the fact that the population had increased, we started to see now a shift in types and how towns were built. And with the lasting change that happened over time was with the connection now to Muslims. During the Crusades, there was now a sort of a revival of learning. People were now trying to learn new things because they had interacted with new cultures that happened during the Crusades. All right, so this is all really important things, guys. This is a really huge moment for Europe, because now this starts to lead into new types of interactions with people, and new concepts are being developed because of this connection and this shift in medieval society. Okay, so now we're going to really focus on England and France and how they developed during this time. Now, what's crazy, guys, is that this entire chapter is basically talking about the entire time through the Crusades. There's so much stuff going on in the background, as the Crusades is such a major point, a major event in European history. There was so much other stuff that happened, just think of it this way. During the church reforms, the church unification, they had sent people out on the Crusades to go fight the Holy War. At the same time as that's going on, there was now a commercial revolution that was going on back home, a shift in the business practices, a shift in power from the kings to even the merchants now started to have, these guilds started to have a lot more power, and now we even started to see England and France start to develop as well. So by the early 800s, guys, small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms cover the former Roman province of Britain. Now, with the decline of the Carolingian Empire, this is the same Carolingian Empire that was led by Charlemagne and his grandsons. They became a patchwork of local feudal states, which is kind of what we already talked about before. This is like the rise of the feudalistic society again. And we start to see really a gradual growth of towns and villages, and even the breakup of a feudalistic system into a more centralized government of nations. And we start to see really the kind of the earliest forms of both England and France, and they would kind of take similar paths in which how they would make a centralized government. So let's take a look. So firstly, we're going to look at how England got to where it was, right? There were many Danish Vikings that were invading England throughout 800s. Remember, this is kind of going into the same concept of how feudalistic society had begun. Remember, with all the different invasions from different groups in Europe that kind of caused a lot of mayhem to occur. So the Danish king Canute had invaded in 1016 and had conquered England, uniting the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. The Norman conquest in 1066, England was invaded one last time by William the Conqueror, who was actually the Duke of Normandy. And guys, remember, Normandy is actually the province north of France. So basically, it's almost like a Frenchman had conquered England, William the Conqueror, and he had fought a battle. In the Battle of Hastings, which really set the stage, the future of England, right? So he had defeated his rival, which is actually Harold Godwinson, and he had won the English crown and crowned himself the King of England, right? He keeps 1/5 of the land and hands out the rest of the land to his supporters as long as they swear allegiance to him, right? This incident, this action, the Battle of Hastings, is crucial to the history of England because it solidifies William the Conqueror as the leader, right? He had won the throne and he consolidated power, and then he actually gave land away to his supporters, which now really set the stage for a centralized government for England in the future. Okay, so over the next few centuries, English kings really had two major goals, right? The first one was, firstly, they wanted to hold and add on to their already held on French land. So Normandy, right? They wanted to increase now French lands because there's this age-old rivalry between England and France, and it really started all the way from William the Conqueror, right? And it really jump starts between King Philip II and Richard the Lionhearted, and we'll talk about them in probably a few minutes. But that was one of their first goals, was to always gain more French land. The second one was they wanted to strengthen their own power over the nobles that were trying to divide the power of the feudalistic system, and over the church. So William the Conqueror's descendants had owned both land in Normandy and in England. So one of the first people that really set themselves apart in England was actually one of his sons, the English King Henry II. And one of the things he did to gain land in France was he actually married Eleanor of Aquitaine from France. Now, they ended up gaining a large province that was a territory known as Aquitaine, which is from France. So when he had married Eleanor of Aquitaine, he had essentially made himself a vassal to the French king, right? Because she wasn't like the princess of the entire kingdom. She was just a very noble, a very high noble, a part of a family of France. So he married into French land. So he became a vassal to the French king, but he was a king of his own right, of England, right? So he was already kind of just consolidating a lot of power by basically marrying into a high noble family of France. So he had all land he had inherited from William the Conqueror, and then he gained land by marrying into a rich family of the French kingdoms. Okay. So when Henry ruled France, he ruled for 35 years, and what he did was he strengthened the royal courts by basically sending royal judges to every part of England at least once a year to basically make sure that they follow in kind of following his rule set. All right, so what they did was they collected taxes, they settled issues, lawsuits, and they punished people for crimes. And they even introduced the idea of a jury system in these English courts. Now, a jury is a little bit different back then than it is currently right now. The way a jury would work, and we kind of get a lot of the basic concepts from this time, so this is like the start of having really a jury. And basically the way that it worked is that he would have usually 12 people that knew the person that was accused, and what they would do is they would answer questions the judge had asked based on the facts. So it's a little bit different back then than it is today. Juries nowadays really are just judging the person that is accused of the crime alone, and that's it, right? That's all they would do based on the facts that they would listen. But the judge would actually ask them the questions. These are all people that knew the accused person. And this concept, the judge's decision based on the facts, really started to be the first form of common law, right? So common law is a really important concept, guys. It's a unified body of laws that really kind of take the main standard of many English-speaking countries. Because remember, and guess what? United States was a colony of England, so this common law really does affect us as well, because we are connected to England forever. So let's take a look at this question here. What impact did the English common law have on the United States? Just take a guess on that one. I think you guys should know that pretty easily. So now we transition to the Magna Carta, right? Everyone knows the Magna Carta. Now, we're starting to really get into some of the names we've heard already. Henry, which was William the Conqueror's son, was succeeded by first by his son, Richard the Lionhearted, right? And we heard of him before. He was in the previous section with the Third Crusade. So he was famous for being a hero of the Third Crusade, creating that alliance, or not alliance, but really that peace treaty with Saladin, right, the leader of the Muslim groups that had taken over the Holy Lands. And he was famous. He was great. And remember, his biggest rival was King Philip II of France, right? So he would gain land, he had conquered land, he was unmatched, he was popular, he had all these things that were kind of beating France in a lot of these different ways. And when Richard died, when he died and he had to relinquish his throne, he gave it to his younger brother, his name was John, okay? When John took the throne, he ruled for a certain amount of years, from 1199 to 1216, but he wasn't that good of a leader. he was actually horrible as leader, to the point where they gave him a really, really messed up name known as John Softsword. Right? They basically said he was a softy. You cannot lead this. You cannot succeed your brother. Just think of that. Imagine. I mean, most people have siblings, right? I mean, if you don't, then you can't really associate with this one as well. But you can have maybe a really close friend that you're basically closest to a sibling. But imagine you have like an older brother that gets a really cool, awesome name like Richard the Lionhearted, because think the English kingdom's main the logo, their animal logo was a lion, so that's why they called him the Lionhearted. That's where the logo was associated with the lion. And then all of a sudden now you take over as the king, and instead of them giving you a cool name like the Lionhearted, they get John Softsword. That's kind of messed up, and it's kind of sad. So the reason why he was called John Softsword was he wasn't a good leader already. He was kind of treating his people pretty poorly. He was abusing his power, and he increased taxes on the nobles. But he had lost so much land to France. Remember the two major goals. One of them was to gain or keep the land that they had from France, and he did the exact opposite. He lost all this land from that he had once held to France. And what's funny, the most hilarious part about this whole thing, is that King Philip II, who was, remember, Richard the Lionheart's biggest rival, they hated each other with a passion, he kept losing and losing and losing to Richard the Lionheart for so many years, and even the other kings before him, losing to Henry and William the Conqueror. They were just losing all the time. And then King Philip II says, finally, John Softsword is now the leader, and now he ends up taking land away from him, increasing his power. So there's a lot of things you can check off here, and why John Softsword was kind of looked bad on, right? He was horrible, right? Not a good leader, bad nickname, and lost a lot of land to France. Did a horrible job, and then on top of that, he's now just causing issues to the nobles, the people who had a lot of power in England. So by 1215, they got so sick of him that they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Okay, and the Magna Carta essentially was a kind of a document that had guaranteed certain rights to the people, right? So he limited the king's rights and guarantees basic political rights to the people. So I highlighted specific things that it does highlight. So firstly, it guarantees rights included no taxation without representation. Wow, where have you heard that line before? It's a pretty big line that if you don't know U.S. history, it's a big one. And they also guarantee a jury trial and protection of the law. So as in, you cannot be put in prison unless, for a made-up reason. You actually have to follow the law, right? Or the concept of the law is supreme. Even your officials have to abide by the law, right? The law is supreme. So that all those concepts are in there as well. And even the Magna Carta is really important because it really sets the standard of basic legal rights that were both in England and in the United States, okay? Now, so this was not just for nobles, guys. This was for everybody, even the lower level people of England. So that's a really important concept about the Magna Carta. So let's take a look with this question here. What is the significance of the Magna Carta? And you guys can answer that on your own. So here's a little excerpt from the Magna Carta. You're going to do a worksheet on the Magna Carta on your own for homework, but this will give you just a little sense of what's here. So let me read this first top part for you. The Magna Carta is considered one of the cornerstones of democratic government. The underlying principle of the document is the idea that all must obey the law, even the king. Its guaranteed rights are an important part of modern liberties and justice. So what I do for you guys, I give you guys a few lines here from the Magna Carta, and I want you guys to read this and answer these two questions up here, okay? So let's look at this video that I actually have. It's on the Magna Carta. It's on a little bit of King John Softsword and his treatment toward the people. So let's have a look here.
This may look like a plain, unassuming piece of parchment, but it's actually one of the most famous documents in the world. Magna Carta, meaning the Great Charter has inspired people across the centuries, from Thomas Jefferson to Mahatma Gandhi. But why was the Charter originally created, and what does it actually say? Let us take you back to medieval England. It's the year 1215, and the ruler is King John. Many people believe that King John was one of the worst kings in history. He imprisoned his former wife, he starved his opponents to death, he allegedly murdered his own nephew, and pulled the beards of the Irish chiefs. King John had imposed heavy taxes on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. If they refused to pay, he punished them severely or seized their property. The barons demanded that King John obey the law. When he refused, they captured London and John was forced to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede in June 1215. The result of the negotiations was written down by the King's clerks into the document we know as Magna Carta. Although most of the Charter's clauses dealt with medieval rights and customs, Magna Carta has become a powerful symbol of liberty around the world. The most famous clause, which is still part of the law today, for the first time gave all free men the right to justice and a fair trial. No man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of their equals and by the law of the land. To no one will we sell. However, this clause was not as liberal as it sounds. The Charter only applied to free men. The vast majority of people in 1215 were unfree peasants who were ruled over by their landowners. And although Magna Carta was intended to create peace between King John and his rebellious barons, England was plunged into civil war after the Pope declared the Charter invalid. When King John died of dysentery in 1216, 9-year-old Henry III took to the throne. To keep the peace, Magna Carta was reissued several times during the 13th century, until it was finally made part of English law. Magna Carta has lived on for 800 years and is echoed in the United States Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Perhaps Magna Carta's most important legacy is that everyone, including our leaders, must obey the law. What started out as a document of specific complaints from a group of barons has turned into an international symbol of liberty, without which we might not have the rights we value so much today.
Okay, so that's a pretty good. I like the video. It's a little cartoonish. Yeah, I don't think he grabbed the beards of the Irish kings, but yeah, I think it's a pretty good one to use to kind of get the general sense of how how everything went down. I think they did a good job on this one. So let's take a look at the next portion. All right, so what also does take a major next step toward making this more of a democratic style of government is the model parliament. All right, so So in 1295, as you already saw, there was a lot of reissuing of the Magna Carta, and one of the moments that this happens is really where to kind of consolidate power and to really make things stable. Edward I summons wealthy townsmen and knights to raise taxes. Together with bishops and lords, they end up forming what they know as a parliament, and parliament's a legislative body. Now there's two houses of parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Over the next century, guys, the king has called basically the knights and burgesses whenever there was a new tax that needed to get passed, or a new tax that he wanted to issue, and Parliament was always met and to kind of discuss the really the nitty-gritty details of what the tax is going to be involved with, how much money that's going to be. And there is basically the two groups gradually had created their own assemblies. One of them was called the House of Commons. The other one, which was made by there's the nobles and bishops met separately in the House of the Lords. So there's the House of the Commons, which is more of the common folk, and then with the knights, and then there was the lords and bishops that met in the House of Lords, right? And very similar to the Magna Carta, this had provided a royal check onto the king, as in they couldn't just make a decree and everyone would have to automatically abide by it. They ended up creating the Parliament and the Magna Carta were basically ways in which they can limit the power of the king and have the people really have a say in what happens with their government, which is a pretty big step during this time of feudalism and kingdoms and some monarchies. So this is a pretty big step for that. So now we're going to transition looking at France, because we just talked about England and how really the democratic system really grew from there. So now we're looking at the start of France. So after Charlemagne's empire had really broken up, France had broken up into really 47 separate feudal territories. And they had the new dynasty was founded by Hugh Capet, which was actually a duke from central France, using Paris as his capital, right? So you understand that with that being said, where France was using, Hugh Capet was using Paris as the capital of France, you can tell that this was really the guy that set the stage, because Paris is still the major city as it is today. All right. Now he uses the Capetans, the Capet's rule from Paris had lasted for a very long time. And early leaders of this group were weak, but generally they become stronger and stronger. And they actually had. Paris was located right in the middle of a lot of these major trade routes, so it actually gave them a lot of influence over trade of this area. And eventually, because of this power, because of this wealth they do gain over time, they end up gaining enough influence to unite France behind them as the leaders. Now, the biggest, most powerful leader of the Capuchin dynasty was King Philip II. Now, we already heard about him like 100 times, and he was a great leader for France. The problem was that he was facing just awesome leaders of England, right? As in, he was the leader of France during two major kings that were really expanding the territory of England, right? Because remember, Henry II, who had married Eleanor of Aquitaine, he had already expanded land into Aquitaine. And then Henry's son, which was Richard the Lionhearted, was his arch rival, and he was beating him up. He was always taking land away from France, and he was failing all the time. Luckily for him, he ended up living past all those kings and finally going up against King John Softsword, right? And this was a perfect time for him. He was able to now consolidate power and expand the territory more than any other French king has done before him. He establishes bailiffs to collect taxes and even run courts to now even gain more wealth of his kingdom. Now, when you look at King Philip's heirs, he did have some pretty solid rulers that had not really surpassed him, but had actually done a pretty good job. Usually, a lot of times you look at these kings, they do have horrible heirs that kind of take control, and they don't really do a good job. But King Philip II's heirs actually did a decent job. His grandson, Louis IX, strengthens the central government. He actually creates what we know as the appeals court. If you know anything about government and politics, especially the judicial system, we have a thing called the District Court of Appeals. And that's actually the court that's right below the Supreme Court of the United States. And it's the concept of it comes from this idea. The appeals court, which actually can overturn decisions from lower courts, which is exactly what the Court of Appeals does. They reverse decisions if they want, or oversee previous decisions from district courts, and they can overrule them. And he actually had strengthened the royal courts of France to kind of consolidate the monarchy's power of France and to kind of weaken feudal ties of the local areas. Now, what's crazy about Louis IX was that he was such a great king, such a well-loved king, that he was considered a saint. He was made a saint by the Catholic Church. Saint Louis, all right, that's him, and he was beloved. And so then when you look at his son, which is actually Philip the Fourth, he is actually, it's kind of ironic because his father had become a saint, and then his son basically challenges the Pope's authority, which is kind of like ironic if you really think about it. He refused to allow a priest to pay taxes to the king. The Pope refused to have the priest pay taxes to the king, and it kind of challenged authority to one another. His dispute of the right of the Pope to be able to control the church affairs in his kingdom really separated the authority of the church in France, because understand that they're kind of trying to one-up each other. And when the Pope says that they don't have to pay taxes to the king, he's trying to say then, well, then they aren't allowed to be here. You can't control church affairs that are in my kingdom because you're not my king, right? And this is kind of a big deal. So what he does to really consolidate the power is he ends up calling together really a giant meeting, which is known as the Estates General, right? And we're going to talk about that in a second. I just want to show you guys another section here. This is going to talk about the two developments of both England and France, and I want you guys to answer these two questions to go along with it. I don't know why it's broken up this way. Something must have happened in Glitch, but as I said before, he creates a meeting known as the Estates General. Now, he actually asks another group to be involved in this, the Third Estate, which actually was on his side in this matter. The First Estate was made up of the church leaders. The Second Estate was made up of lords. And then the last estate, the Third Estate, was made up of the commoners, landholders, and merchants. And this group here was extremely important in this matter because they were sided with the king, right? And just like very similar to English Parliament in its early years, the Estates General helped increase royal power against the nobility, and it's a little different than Parliament because it's not as powerful as Parliament does become for this time period. Remember, Parliament had almost a say in everything that had happened in the power of the king, as in it didn't really limit the king's power. It actually consolidated it for him. But later on in French history, does become a major, really important concept because a Third Estate does play a big role in overthrowing the French monarchy in the French Revolution, which you guys will learn about in Global 10. So what I want you guys to do, answer this question: what three estates made up the Estates General? Which is, it's pretty simple. So when you look at both the Estates General and you look at when you look at Parliament and you look at the Magna Carta, you really can see how both England and France established a democratic tradition at an early point in history. They really created a centralized government that would be able to kind of rule a large area pretty effectively. The idea of the common law system and even court system helped support a centralized government that was ruled by a central power and even had respect of the people. And the fact that the people had a lot of influence over what happened with that government is a really important concept that really does change the framework of how history does progress from here. All right, so guys, I want you guys to answer these questions on your own. Whose rights did the Magna Carta originally intend to defend? Right, so we think of it when they originally intend to defend. How did the Battle of Hastings change the course of English history? Which of the following correctly matches a Capian king with one of his accomplishments? And then lastly, who forced whom to sign the Magna Carta? And then I want you guys to answer these two main idea questions. How did English kings increase their power and reduce the power of the nobles? And then 15, why was Philip II called Augustus? All right, guys, that's going to be it for here. We got one more section left and we are done. All right, guys, that's it for me. Have a good one.